Talks are underway, and already both sides are digging in their heels. As the U.S. and Russia go head-to-head on Ukraine, it's clear the two are far apart. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said he doesn't expect any breakthroughs and warned the Kremlin of severe consequences if it invades Ukraine.
And the question really now is whether President Putin will take the path of diplomacy and dialogue or seeks confrontation.
NATO joined the U.S. in warning Russia of harsh penalties.
Any further aggression against Ukraine would come at a high political and economic price. NATO allies are united in their support for all nations to choose their own path.
But as hundreds of thousands of Russian troops amass at the Ukraine border, Moscow has demands of its own. It has stipulated that NATO not grow its ranks or admit Ukraine to the alliance. Russia also wants the U.S. to withdraw troops from Eastern Europe. The U.S. has military bases all across the continent, more than 250 in Western Europe and more than a dozen in the East. The U.S. says withdrawing its forces is not on the table. For its part, the EU has called for sanctions against Moscow in the case of an invasion. Washington has tried to assure its European allies that they won't be sidelined in the talks.
Good evening. Today is January 10th, 2022, and this is the 81st episode of New Paradigms. I am your host, Sargis Sangari. My returning guest today is my dear friend, Clare Lopez. Clare is the founder and also the president of Lopez Liberty, LLC, with a mission to alert and also educate Americans on a range of national security threats, international as well as from the Islamic movements, to include the Muslim Brotherhood, and more importantly, the collaboration that is taking place among the rank and file of the Marxists and communists who are operational in the United States. In 2020, Clare was named a senior analyst for Ravinia Associates, which is a strategic cooperative communication firm that is based in Virginia. From 2014 to 2020, Clare Lopez served as VP for Research and Analyst at the Center for Security Policy. She has been a senior fellow at the London Center for Policy Research and a member of the Board of Advisors for the Canadian McKinsey Institute. From 2013 to 2016, Lopez served as a member of the Citizens Commission on Benghazi and continues as a member of the Citizens Commission on National Security. Formerly the VP of the Intelligence Summit, she was a career operational officer with the Central Intelligence Agency. More importantly for us, Clare is a senior advisor member of the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement. Clare, it is good to have you here. It's my pleasure to have you here again with us today, especially on the day that the U.S. and Russia security talks began at the U.S. mission in Greenland or Geneva, Switzerland. It is good to have you here.
Thank you, Sargis. Very glad to be back with you again.
Clare, I guess I would like to ask you, what is your impression as far as where we are? And I know we can go back as far as with the timeline of when this started. From what we both know is really once the pipeline between Russia and Europe was green-lighted, Russia started moving troops really on the border between Ukraine and Russia. But how did we get here today?
Well, I think the real point of reference here is the beginning of the Joe Biden administration here in the United States. And as we know, during his predecessor's time, during the Trump administration, and particularly during the time when Rick Grenell was ambassador to Germany in that administration, the United States opposed the completion of the building of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with its final endpoint in Germany. But as soon as the Biden administration took office, they greenlighted the completion of that pipeline, removed any sanctions that had been levied against Russia previously, and the pipeline was indeed completed. Now, it's not open yet. It's not ready to go yet. There are regulatory processes underway in Germany. As we hear, those processes probably will not be completed even until the second half of this year, 2022, perhaps. But nevertheless, the pipeline is finished. And Moscow and Vladimir Putin probably visualized the new administration in Washington, D.C. as, shall we say, somewhat weaker than its predecessor, the Trump administration. And they judged that there was a window of time, perhaps. I mean, they know about our midterm elections coming up in November of this year, as well as we do. And they judged that there was a window of time during which they could achieve some objectives. And among those objectives, of course, primary, is to ensure that any of the former states that were part of the USSR, now independent, like Ukraine, would not become members of NATO. That is a primary objective, and I would say a primary concern of Putin's Russia today. So those things have come together in time now, and here we are.
No, look, I think it's very important for us to really look at the pipeline and what it caused, because under the previous administration, under the Trump administration, Trump tried to break the oil monopoly, and how he tried to break it was to diversify who can export oil, to include the United States, was able to become a major exporter of oil. But when the current administration came in and they basically stopped all the possibility of us being much more broader as far as oil independent, and also, by the way, we had to even tap into our reserves because of what was happening globally under the Biden administration. Ted Cruz actually went after trying to find out who are these companies that are tied really with the Nord Stream pipeline and who is a major funder. And it was the Democrats and the Biden administration that did not want to have any type of sanctions against the people who are going to benefit from it. I know that just this year in January, even Germany, which is a major exporter now, is going to be of the oil out of Russia, went ahead and actually shut down half of their remaining nuclear power plants, which is, green power, if you want to call it. And they're going to shut down all their power plants, and they're much more looking at going back in time and being more gas and oil dependent. So it boggles my mind, why did we do what we did under the current administration to make sure that we actually create the monopolies that existed before that were squeezing the U.S. We stopped production here, and we are okay with the Germans actually being more reliant on gas and natural oil that's coming out of Germany, out of Russia. So maybe you could give us some clarification. I mean, I'm a basic guy, but when I look at the tea leaves, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Geographically speaking, one would superficially say it makes sense that Russia, rich in oil and gas, would supply the energy needs of Europe, in particular Western Europe, Germany, and so forth. But then when you look at the geopolitics of it, the strategic advantage to be gained by Russia in controlling that supply of oil and gas to Europe, it's a different story. And this was why, under the Trump administration and Ambassador Rick Grenell in Berlin, that the United States firmly opposed the completion of the Nord Stream pipeline, knowing that its completion and eventually, bringing it online would hand a tremendous advantage and amount of leverage to Russia over our NATO allies. We're talking here especially about Germany, but others in Europe too, to which the pipeline's energy would flow. And that was unacceptable to the United States as a senior partner member of NATO. But as soon as the Biden administration took office, yes, they not only canceled our own energy independence achieved under President Trump for the first time, and I think it was something like 70 years that we were energy independent, canceled the Keystone Pipeline, canceled other pipelines, put thousands of Americans out of work at the stroke of a pen, if he knew what he was signing. But willingly and knowingly, shut down, for example, the exploitation of U.S. energy sources in Alaska, in Anwar, deliberately putting us, the United States, back in a position which is now like that of Germany and other Western European countries, under the leverage of OPEC, for one, and other sources like Russia of energy needs, of oil and gas. And this doesn't make any sense whatsoever unless you view and look at the Biden administration as viewing America first with disdain. Unless you understand that the Biden administration and many of the people in it, the officials now in that administration, same as officials who previously served in the Obama administrations from 2008 until 2016, many of the same people back again, they come to office and to this administration now with a worldview of Weltanschauung, if you will, that America is a force for ill in the world. And that in order to correct that, air quotes, I guess, correct, as they would see it, America needs to be taken down a notch or two. That we need to become just one of the, 190 something other countries in the world. And, our exceptionalism is just like that of, any other nation in the world and nothing special. That's the worldview. And if you understand that worldview, then you can see why these officials who dominate the Biden administration would support policies like these. To the rest of us, it seems insane, about as insane as what you were just showing there, Sargis, about Germany shutting down its nuclear capability in favor of reliance on, a Russian government that at any moment now, if they're completely dependent on those sources of energy and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in particular, that at any time that Putin decides, he wants a certain policy out of Germany or one of the other NATO countries, all he has to do is turn off the spigot. And in the middle of a freezing cold Northern European winter, that's the leverage that's been given away willingly with both hands by them and by us.
Well, not just that. I mean, can you imagine if what happens, let's say somebody in Ukraine is not happy because we are not supporting them or supplying them with the type of weapon system they want. And let's say, a larger conflict breaks out internally in Ukraine. I mean, you could have individuals in Ukraine sabotaging that particular pipeline. And if they do, that means 100% of the gas flow, natural gas flow, and a lot of it is already in the pipes, but 100% of the gas flow is not going to be reaching Europe. Now, Russia can't survive a couple of months of not making money off of the existing contract that it has to provide that support to the Europeans. But I don't know if Europe can survive even a month or a month and a half of that. And the other piece that really boggles my mind is the fact that you have now Germany as being a major facilitator when it comes to weapons support and distribution, maybe through NATO to even Ukraine. If that's the case, I guess, you could be a devil's advocate and say who would be benefiting from a conflict in the region. It could be the, military-industrial complex that would be using now the possibility of trying to force a larger sale of weapons into Ukraine. And, with Putin recently stating to the Americans and NATO that I don't have any place to fall back to if you force my hand on Ukraine, given the fact that we know that in the East, the Chinese are really moving into Russia. And I know you have studied, going back years now, as far as understanding the, Siberia and how the Russians now today demographically are losing in the region, and the Chinese are moving in. In the past, you used to have to be a Russian who could be elected at local levels to represent those people from those areas in Moscow. But now you have Chinese who speak Russian and Chinese actually being the representatives, with a population of Chinese really extending into the East. So he's being squeezed by both from the West, from NATO, and he's being squeezed by where most of his oil and natural resources sit in the, I should say in the West by NATO, in the East by China. But I wanted to kind of have your impression on what is happening in Russia. You think that this might play somewhat into the dilemma that Putin has?
Well, Russia is extraordinarily sensitive to encroachments, as they see it, threats around their periphery, on their borders. And we will recall that Putin, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has said in the past that the catastrophe of his life, back when he was a KGB officer, was the breakup of the Soviet Union back in 1991, at which time the 5 Central Asian republics, now independent, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, became independent countries. Well, perhaps I should say independent in air quotes, because they're not truly independent of Moscow, but they are republics of their own now. And then, of course, to Russia's west, Ukraine, and the sense by Putin and Moscow that NATO, the NATO alliance, is moving further towards the east and encroaching on what Russia would consider its near abroad, particularly Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and probably won't be. But Putin nevertheless fears increasing Western influence in Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine itself does border on other actual NATO countries like Bulgaria and Romania, for example. So, as you say, Sargis, yes, from the east and the west, Putin sees threats. Now, he has moved, the numbers that I hear are different, but probably upwards of 100,000 troops plus tanks, artillery, and other weaponry to Ukraine's eastern border with Russia, and has been threatening an invasion, which may or may not actually take place. I do not see, by the way, Ukrainian elements trying to sabotage the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I mean, the whole point of routing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to the north, way north, to bypass Ukraine, which indeed this pipeline now does with its terminal in Germany, but from a very northern route. So I don't see that as a likelihood, but the situation on the border of Ukraine and Russia is still very uncertain. There were, yes, the beginning of talks today, Monday, January 10, 2022, in Geneva between the Russians and the United States. And further talks will be held shortly in Brussels to involve there also NATO. There are different analysts that I have read and respect. For example, one, Andrei Ilarionov, who is at the Institute for the Study of War, previously at the Cato Institute. I'm sorry, I'm mixing this up. I apologize. Formerly at the Cato Institute, currently at the Center for Security Policy, that's Andrei Ilarionov, who has a very good analysis out there that basically says that Putin and Russia are seeking to obtain certain concessions from the United States and from Russia. And you mentioned some of those, Sargis, that demands put forth by the Russian defense minister just about a month ago, middle of December in 2021, demanded such things as a pledge that Ukraine and any other state that formerly was part of the USSR would never become a member of NATO, that NATO and US forces, ships, planes would never sail in or overfly airspace, waterways that could be conceived of as a threat to Russia, these kinds of things, demanding that neither NATO nor the United States position intermediate range, shorter range nuclear missiles in Europe. We'll recall something of this kind of demand being made during the Reagan years, which he dispatched with expeditiously. More demands along those lines, in other words. So those were the demands put forward. I expect that they were part of the discussion that began today in Geneva, will be taken up shortly in Brussels. But this all stems from a Russian fear of encroachment around its near abroad, and a Putin-dominated Moscow government desire to re-establish as much of the power and influence of Russia, now the Russian Federation, as had previously been the case with the USSR. That was a catastrophe, the breakup for him. He wants to put it back together again. That's what he wants to do. And Ukraine is very much a part of that.
No, it's not just Ukraine, as you mentioned. A big part of it is also what is happening in the stands. As you saw, and that would be for a different show, of course. What is happening in the stands right now? Putin's worry is that he may lose certain portions of the stands if he doesn't get involved with his military force structures, possibly to the Chinese too. So you're talking about. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I apologize. But what I was going to say is what we're referring to, and just very quickly, we can talk about it some more. But on the 1st of January this year, 2022, the government of Kazakhstan removed price controls on the supply of fuel, especially gasoline. Immediately, naturally, the prices shot up. People taken by surprise took to the streets in protest, and those protests very quickly grew from simply outrage at the huge price increases in fuel for them and gasoline for their cars, grew to include opposition to the regime, a totalitarian, very much authoritarian regime in Kazakhstan. I'm paging here to get the name right. President Kasym Jomart Tokayev, very much as described in a blog entry today by good friend and superb analyst Jeff Nyquist, the Jeff Nyquist blog. Tokayev, described as a total Soviet apparatchik, and that he is. So very quickly, Tokayev turned to Russia and other members of this group that is called the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which includes Russia and other neighboring states, to send troops to help him, Tokayev, put down the demonstrations and the protests, which they really very quickly did. Putin sent something like 3,000, maybe 2,500, 3,000 troops. And Tokayev gave orders, shoot to kill, The protesters, over 160 something of them already, as I've heard so far, have been killed. Something like 6,000, maybe more, already under arrest. They're crushing those protests. But that has to do, again, with a very huge and naturally rich country, Kazakhstan, on the border of Russia, with over 4,750-mile border that they share. And Putin is not about to let Kazakhstan, slip away in any meaningful sense. It's rich in oil and gas and minerals of various kinds, uranium included. And it is also the site of what Russia used to use, Soviet Union used to use as its space launch site. So all these reasons taken together, Russia was not going to let Kazakhstan slip away, and knowing too that Kazakhstan there in Central Asia is so far distant from certainly the United States, but also from Europe, that there's no meaningful real interest or possibility, for us to become involved in any way there. You can basically put down that protest, without concern for the kinds of concerns, I should say, that come into play for the situation with Ukraine.
Well, if it did slip away, it was going to slip away in the hands of the Chinese anyway, because they have an influence there too. You talk about 4,000-mile border that now really kind of sits between Russia and China, and somebody was going to grab a hold of that territory.
The 4750-mile border is between just Russia and Kazakhstan. There's a further border further to the east between Russia and China.
No, I understand that. But I mean, that territory itself, as we look at it, the major nations look at it as a backyard. So if Russia ain't there and controlling it with their leadership, then if I was China, I would move in. I mean, it's so critical that even Armenia sent 100 soldiers to that particular fight, unfortunately in this case, to help suppress the people and control it under their Russian control. I'm glad you mentioned Andrei's name, because he had looked at it recently on the issue as to, okay, if we're looking at what is happening within the region, he had also looked at the possibility that, as he had noted, that the United States media is really behind pushing this thing, that is fanning the flames of this so-called fight that, our involvement in Ukraine. And it wasn't really Putin. And he also stated at the same time that Putin really jumped on the bandwagon after the U.S. media really started pushing this thing through their companies and productions. So I guess my question is, why is the U.S. media pushing a war, and who is to benefit from this?
I really don't get that part. I'm not sure why outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, Bloomberg News, would be trying to fan these flames, except as you've mentioned before, the military-industrial complex, selling weapons, perhaps providing weapons to Ukraine, which actually I think we ought to be doing. Not troops, not U.S. troops, certainly not. We have no defense obligation, treaty obligation with Ukraine, but certainly to provide defensive weapons such as anti-tank missiles, for example. I think that is something that we ought to do. There are other things that go beyond what Secretary of State Antony Blinken talked about in that press conference you played the clip of there today, threatening sort of unspecifically, non-specifically, it's going to be the worst sanctions you've ever seen, and we've never done it so much before. That only goes so far. I was watching an earlier news show tonight on TV, in which one of the hosts of the program was showing a clip from the time of the Trump presidency when he said, something to the effect of talking about North Korea will obliterate you. It's a difference in credibility, deterrent credibility. But yes, providing defensive weapons to Ukraine, but threatening very specifically to reimpose sanctions against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, for example. Another example of potential threats, it might have been Texas Senator Ted Cruz who mentioned this, perhaps, if I remember. But other kinds of sanctions would be to disconnect Russia from the SWIFT system. That is the international banking system. A specific threat like that, with credibility behind it, would mean so much more than we're going to send the worst sanctions against you that you've ever seen, and you never even dreamed of them before. It's a difference in the level of credibility. But some of the points that both the Institute for the Study of War and separately the analyst Andrei Ilarionov have made include things that perhaps are not so readily apparent to Westerners, maybe. And that is, for example, that Russia cannot really afford to economically, diplomatically, or politically, cannot afford to launch a full-on invasion of Ukraine. Number one, the Ukrainian army knows they're coming, and they've been preparing for a long time, or at least they know they've been threatening, I should say, and have been preparing for a long time. They would fight hard, and it wouldn't be just the army, the official Ukrainian army. It would be every man in Ukraine would join the fight to defend the country. That's the kind of patriotism they have in Ukraine, to defend their territory against such an invasion. And were Russia to launch something like that and then get bogged down in what would be a very costly, long drawn out warfare in Ukraine with guerrilla forces, never mind the standing Ukrainian army itself. Not only would he lose in terms of casualties, which would be sent home in body bags and on stretchers to Russia. Not good for the Russian public to see that. They don't want to see that. Well, nobody does. But also economically, he doesn't have the wherewithal. The strength of the Russian economy could not support getting bogged down in Ukraine. And then finally, diplomatically, if indeed Russia's objectives pursued here in a kind of gray zone, hybrid warfare, information warfare kind of way, Ilarionov makes these points. Getting bogged down, losing lives, casualties, economic bleeding, and then at the same time, having done that, committed to that, were he to do that, Putin, then he would lose all leverage and all possibility of reaching any kind of a diplomatic compromise, such as, for example, he might get NATO in the end to say something like, well, Ukraine is not a member of NATO now, and the accession process would take a really long time, like years and years, and that's just not really going to be in the cards in the near future. That would be a face-saving way out for both sides, just for example, right? But he would lose that. That possibility would be gone. Never mind the fact that NATO and non-NATO countries would rally against such brazen aggression on the part of the Russians. So he would lose whatever diplomatic cards he may think he holds right now by doing that. So these are some of the reasons why Andrei Ilarionov explained he does not think a full-on Russian invasion of Ukraine proper is imminent. But he did say that in those eastern region of Donetsk and Luhansk, what's sometimes called the Donbass, that region in the eastern part of Ukraine, which already, has been invaded, occupied by so-called little green men or militia forces, right? That part of Ukraine already is under quite a lot of Russian influence, power, and presence. And that would have to be negotiated. And of course, that was supposed to have been part of the Minsk agreements from 2014, 2015. Never really resolved, never fulfilled the Minsk agreement signed in Minsk in Belarus in 2015. But the status of those eastern regions, that too would slip away from Russian grasp, diplomatically speaking, that is, were they to all out invade and occupy it militarily. So for all of these reasons, Russia absolutely feels threatened by NATO and potential NATO expansion further to the east, but at the same time, perhaps cannot really afford an all-out military invasion of Ukraine proper.
No, you're right, and it's kind of against what Russia usually does. I mean, if you think about how they took over Crimea, they were already inside of Crimea before the world polities even realized it, and they took it out during that what you call the hybrid process of the type of a force structure that they use. And frankly, to be honest, one of the pieces that we're not really looking at, and Putin knew this, recognized it. If you go back to even year 2000 and take a look at what Putin was talking about, he was starting to look at how information operations in the current digital age is going to work. So you're talking about 22 years ago, he realized that this is where the conflict is going to be. And if he knew that 22 years ago and he starts working that piece to his advantage. We use the word militia as you and me do for our American listeners. We do know that the Ukrainians don't look at those type of force structures. I know that the U.S. administration like to kind of, they didn't even call today a negotiation, or I should say that this negotiation or discussion, just ever presenting our points. But you and I both know that the Ukrainians or Russians are a little bit more blunt in the discussion as to how do we get to the end product. And unfortunately, I don't know if our administration really understands what is happening on the ground. Look, Ukraine benefited a lot from the oil that was being pushed through, and also some of the oil that was coming out of Ukraine. So, that GDP for Ukraine has developed, it has advanced. Because of that, they're more Western looking, they want to be part of the West. And the problem was, once you open up the pipeline ability and also the systems that feed into that pipeline, specifically natural gas, Ukraine was looking at benefiting much more for its GDP directly using the Russian and German agreed upon contract and pipeline, which is one of the reasons Russia right now is being squeezed from the east and the west. And Putin wasn't going to put up with that. But he's much more subtle and when he wants to take over a country. And that's why this kind of out of his character. And I think maybe it's mostly because what he has understood and what he looked at going back to 2000 as to how to fight this fight in this current digital age. I do want to, before we go on, I do want to kind of do a quick reset here, Claire, and take a look at what the State Department said today based on the discussions came up. And then I want to be able to capture your points and possibly your perspective as to how do you progress forward with negotiations now. So with that said, we have a video. I'm going to introduce how the State Department is digesting today's discussions.
Here today in Geneva, we concluded the extraordinary session of the Bilateral Strategic Stability Dialogue, where the U.S. delegation was led by Deputy Secretary of State Wendy R. Sherman. In candid, substantive discussions that lasted nearly 8 hours, the United States came with several ideas of reciprocal actions that the U.S. and Russia can take that would be in our security interest and would improve strategic stability. These preliminary ideas, as you've heard from the deputy, included missile placement and the future of certain missile systems in Europe, along the lines of the now defunct INF treaty between the US and Russia. We also shared that we are open to discussing ways we can set reciprocal limits on the size and scope of military exercises, and to improving transparency around those exercises, again, on a reciprocal basis. We were firm, however, in pushing back on security proposals we've heard from Moscow that are simply non-starters for the United States. We will not, for example, allow anyone to slam close NATO's open door policy, which has always been central to the NATO alliance. We also will not forego bilateral cooperation with sovereign states that wish to work with the United States. And we will not make decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine, about Europe without Europe, or about NATO without NATO. As we say to our allies and partners, nothing about you without you. The United States is committed to meaningful, reciprocal dialogue with Russia, just as we are committed to consulting and coordinating closely with our allies and partners. We are ready to continue discussions on the bilateral issues we identified today as soon as is practical, and we made that clear in the discussions today. To that end, tomorrow, Deputy Secretary Sherman will travel to Brussels to brief the North Atlantic Council and the EU Political and Security Committee, as well as to meet with the EU EEAS Secretary General Sonino, all ahead of the NATO-Russia Council meeting planned for Wednesday morning. We have been and will continue to be moving in lockstep with our allies and partners at every level. Deputy Secretary Sherman will travel to Brussels for continued consultations ahead of those multilateral engagements with the Russian Federation that are slated for later this week. Russian officials have said that they want to move swiftly, and the United States is ready to do so. At the same time, negotiations on complex topics like arms control cannot be completed in a matter of days or even weeks. We must give diplomacy and dialogue the time and space required to make progress on such complex issues.
Claire, the list of demands that Putin sent to Biden, and I would say the West executives who are probably driving this whole issue, seem to have favored not just Russia in this case and these discussions, but also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is led by China, and Russia is a signatory to it, with the demands that the U.S. essentially become a isolationist when it comes to the power that is trying to project within the region. And as you know, as we have left Afghanistan, we are weakened in the Middle East, even the Horn of Africa, we're not able to do anything. It boggles my mind. If you're not going to use sanctions, as you mentioned earlier, against the oil sectors, if you're going to put all the chips into the hands and leverage of the Russians to be able to turn off the spigot and have NATO and Europe really have to be beholden to them, but the only other option that they would have would be China with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and Iran possibly pushing natural gas to the Mediterranean and selling it to the Europeans that will embolden them. Even you mentioned the SWIFT system of banking, while the U.S. was too busy eating itself internally, Russia was working with the Chinese, who had developed their counter to SWIFT and actually had done operational capacity on whether or not what would happen if suddenly Russia had been sanctioned and was not allowed to work within the SWIFT system. I don't know. I'll leave it up to you. You got to tell me. It doesn't seem like we have leverage in the discussion. You heard the points from the Department of State. Reciprocal on what? How are you going to have any type of a leverage against Putin as he takes the next step when it comes to the information operational gambit? If you could give us some guidance on that, and then how would you approach this from the U.S. side?
Leverage depends on credible deterrence. And I'm not sure that the Biden administration currently is able to muster credible deterrence. It's good to see NATO, standing fast, that they will decide, the NATO treaty members will decide who may join, when they may join. They're not going to be dictated to by Russia as to which states may or may not ever join NATO, nor is NATO going to be dictated to about the stationing of troops or planes or ships or operations of those, or of weapons, of missiles in NATO territory, that meaning Europe. So those were good indicators today in those statements that we were just listening to. And NATO, so long as it hangs together, does have that kind of credibility. I don't think the Biden administration has that kind of credibility, and that's a chink in the armor of NATO. But the way forward, I think is really to stick to the elements we just listened to in that statement. That NATO will not be dictated to about, which countries may enter, when, how, what processes. They're not going to be dictated to by Moscow. And they're not going to be dictated to in terms of where they may operate as the treaty alliance that they are. And at the same time, I think that's what the talks are about, is reaching some kind of understanding with Moscow that we're not going to be bullied. We, United States and NATO, we're not going to be bullied. But at the same time, we're not going to bully Russia either. We're not going to invade Russia. We're not going to threaten, the government of Russia. But the border situations, Ukraine, talk about Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, et cetera, remain sensitive. We understand that. And that's what the talks have to be about. But they cannot allow, NATO and the United States can allow themselves to be dictated to about where they may operate, with what weapon systems, in what way, and they have to stick to that.
No, they have to stick to it, and well said. I mean, and I think that's a point at least the Ukrainians and the Russians will understand. How do we go forward? As you said, Putin's more scared of NATO than he is afraid of our administration and the United States overall. So we got to see where NATO is going to be when it comes to bucking back against Putin if he decides to shut off the spigot. And then we'll see where we go. We got a lot more information we could discuss, Claire, but, in the hour we've been on now, I think that kind of gives a gist to our listeners as to where we are. With that said, we'll see how this whole situation develops. And then hopefully we'll come talk a little bit more about it. I think the key point here, as we all had said, is probably tied to the so-called pipeline. And I'm sure, as they would say in Washington, money talks, BS walks. If we can maybe start looking more closely as to possibly to what are the dollars that are tied to the pipeline and who's benefiting from it, whether it be in the European Parliament, and there's some individuals there that could be affected by Russian lobbies, and even in the United States, as we know, individuals within the POTUS's family who have worked for the Ukrainian, energy sector, and what do those things translate into the dollars, and what happens whether or not with our ability to affect things. For our listeners out there who liked our discussion with Claire and the show, we ask you, we have the QR for United of Sin Appeal. If you could donate to that 501c3, all the support and help we need. We're trying our best to help the Christians of South Sudan this year, and also the Assyrian Christians of Northern Iraq. And Claire, for another day, but ISIS isn't just being bombed in northern Sudan by the Israelis. They just manifested themselves recently on the ground in South Sudan, and they're starting to put themselves together again for possibility and more action in northern Iraq against, unfortunately, those certain Christians who usually get the brunt of, elephants fighting within the region for control. I'll give you the last word, Claire, and we'll close it out and get you back again. You've been an absolute blessing as for your advice for the Near East Center.
Well, thank you, Sargis. Very glad to offer what I might. Thanks to all who are listening in this evening and who may watch it later as well. You can find me in a number of different places. I am on social media, amazing still, at Clare M. Lopez on Twitter, my name as well, on Facebook, at Lopez Liberty on Telegram. And I publish and circulate my writing and my videos at different places, including the United West, including the Citizens Commission on National Security, the American Truth Project, and also with the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and videos like the Glazoff Gang with Jamie Glazoff, and publishing my written pieces at Front Page Magazine. So look in all of those places for more of me. Thank you very much for everyone who's watching in.
No, Claire, it's a blessing. You made me laugh when you said, you're still on social media. Actually, for our viewers, last week's video we put on Rumble is somewhere around 5,000 views by now. After getting close to 2,000 views on YouTube, YouTube took it down after a week, saying that it doesn't meet our community standards. So I hear you. I know exactly what you're dealing with. So for our viewers who are trying to look at our last week's program, please go to Rumble. This discussion today is also being live streamed on Clubhouse, and on Thursdays and Fridays, usually after we do the discussion with our guest, in this case Claire, this week we follow up with a question and answer period also on Clubhouse. So do follow the Near East there, and hopefully, Claire, I think this Friday we're going to have a discussion on Clubhouse. And with that said, it is an honor for somebody like you who's on multiple different organizational platforms to be an advisory board member of the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, we will see you next week. There's New Paradigms.